3 years of data on applications, hiring, and performance. And that's really the key attraction of using Washington, D.C. public schools. In addition to it being an interesting place, I guess, the real key aspect is they've got this interesting recruitment and hiring program. But really, the key aspect of Washington, D.C. that differentiates it from other places, as Tom very well knows, is they evaluate all of their teachers in a pretty rigorous assessment system every year. Okay, so we're not just focusing on test scores in elementary school. We're focusing on all kinds of teachers at all levels, all subjects, et cetera, et cetera. So the set of teachers that we're going to focus on apply to teach in Washington, D.C. through a program called TeachDC. It's sort of like, you think about it as like the main pipeline if you want a job in D.C. All right, it's not the only way to get a job in D.C., but it's kind of the main place you would apply. And it was expanded in 2011 when our data start, basically with the work of our co-author, Ben Lindy, who revamped the program. The data on applicants gets collected in several stages, up to 4, but in one of the years it was 4 stages. I'll explain later. The next years it was 3. But you can think about it as kind of like a funnel. There's an initial stage where you submit some information, and then we cull the herd and get to a finer and finer set of people until we arrive at a set of candidates who are recommended. They fall into a recommended pool, and that recommended pool, a list, is sent out to principals through an online website where they can go and look for candidates that have been screened, basically, for quality. Now, we don't know how much DC principals use the online interface because DCPS does not track it. Okay? Anecdotally, they think that it gets used a lot, but that principals don't delve into all of the data that they could get through the system. That is, principals could click through a lot of links and try to get at the underlying scores that applicants are getting on all of these various stages in their application. But the first thing they'll see is essentially the applicant's name and a link to their CV and contact information. And the evidence that I'm going to show you is consistent with principals using the list, okay, and checking those people out, but that they're pretty much ignoring all of the underlying continuous metrics that determine whether or not someone's on the list in the first place. But we don't know. Okay, we don't have any of that data. So the hiring process in DC is fairly decentralized. School principals make the ultimate determination on who gets hired and who doesn't. Because of change in contracts like we've seen in other places, including New York, there's no forced seniority hiring any longer in DC. There's sort of mutual consent, so they make the hiring decision. And we really don't know a lot about what happens at the principal level, and that is a problem. But they can hire whoever they want, and they do hire a lot of the TeachDC recommended pool. I'll show you that later. But they don't have to hire TeachDC applicants. They can really hire whoever they want. And so we'll see they hire people who fail to get over one of the thresholds in the TeachDC process. They'll hire some people who don't complete the TeachDC process. They'll hire people who we never even see coming through the TeachDC process. Okay, some of those people are through a program like Teach for America, but many of them are just, they got a job in DC through some other informal or less formal channel. Okay? Susanna. Yeah. So we do not. I'll get back to this. We lack a lot of. We lack all data on offers declined and accepted. Okay. Well, we don't accepted offers, obviously, but we see who applies and then we see who gets hired. So a big challenge in what we do, and I think in most of this research, is sort of separating labor demand and labor supply. We're going to see hiring outcomes. And I'm going to spin some stories that it might be labor demand. The evidence is consistent with it being labor demand driven, but we don't know. So we have offer data, but that is totally non-credible data because basically, as you probably familiar with, I call you up and I say, I have an opening to teach 6th grade. Would you like it? And then you say yes, and then I do the paperwork. And if you say no, I don't do the paperwork, and we never see it. Oh, no, yeah, we don't have applications data. We don't have school-level applications data or like who interviewed where or anything like that. We're planning to run out a survey this year to try to get some of that. We were talking about that before, but we don't have it at the moment. Yeah. Yeah, so they have to have a license, or they have to be part of one of the alt-cert programs, like Teach for America or the Teaching Fellows. Yeah, but there's no more just hire anybody without a license in DC. I think I just said that. We don't have any of that data. We don't have any of that data. So those are all some caveats. So let me give you some background on how people would go through this selection process. So first, you would just give TeachDC some background data. So confirming that you have a license, how much prior experience you have, education background, some test scores, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the first year of TeachDC, which is when we were most heavily involved in helping them structure the process, there was this initial stage where people just wrote these very general essays. 2 general essays about instructional strategies and about using data to drive instruction. In the end, I think this was basically a check on can you write coherent 200-word essays in English. It was not a very, very high bar. We don't really focus on this as one of our predictors because we only have it in one of the years. In addition to these essays, we also asked a whole bunch of personality questions, and we gave them the GRIT index. People are here probably very familiar with the GRIT measure from Angela Duckworth. Turns out that that's complete crap when you ask it on a high-stakes employment survey. Everyone's very gritty. Everyone's very conscientious. Nobody is neurotic. I mean, the only thing that we can use from that is extroversion, because it turns out if you ask how much do you agree with a question with this item, and the item is I am very talkative, not everyone says 5 out of 5. So we can see extroversion, and it turns out we'll get a little traction out of extroversion on who gets hired, but mostly we can't use this personality stuff. And then they also asked people to take the Haberman pre-screen. I don't know if people are familiar with the Haberman. Anybody not familiar with the Haberman? Okay, so let me just show you an example of a Haberman question. I think it is interesting. It's not super relevant for most of the paper, but I will show you some Haberman results at the end. So I'll just read you out one of the examples we have up here. Teachers burn out because they, A, do the same thing over and over, B, get worn down by duties other than teaching, or C, have chosen the wrong profession. What I want you to first notice, at least what I think is first notable, is that the right answer is not obvious. Okay? Where do these questions come from? Marty Haberman studied a set of people who he thought were star teachers in the Milwaukee Public Schools, and then figured out what he thought a set of beliefs and attitudes were of these star teachers, and then set about to create a multiple choice test. And then in addition to that, there's a big interview protocol, but we don't use any of the interview protocol, but this test designed to elicit information about do you have those same attitudes and beliefs as the star teachers in Milwaukee. Okay, I don't know if people who know more about the Haberman than me, but I think that's my rough sense of what it is. Okay, so it's a multiple choice test. And what's interesting about it is that when you ask it on a high-stakes employment survey, it's not that everyone can automatically give you what is the right answer, because the right answer is a bit mysterious. I do not know the right answer, because it's proprietary, and they sell the test. If you knew what the answers were, it'd be a problem. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we have only that for 1 year, so we really focus our analysis kind of starting at stage 2, which in all 3 years was a subject-specific written assessment. So, for example, you would select a subject area. You'd say, I want to teach high school biology, and they would give you a sample of, let's say, a student's lab report on, on some amoeba, and then you have to say what the student did right and what the student did wrong, and how you're going to fix the gaps in their knowledge. What kind of strategies would you use to help that student? That's the kind of an example. In addition, people who were going to give math instruction in elementary or middle school took the Ball Hill Knowledge of Mathematics for Teaching test. I'll skip over the example of a question for that, but it's a multiple choice test, and you should think about it as it's not just do you know how to do simple middle school level math, but do you know it well enough that you can see there's actually multiple ways to solve a problem, and you could identify the ways in which students could misinterpret or interpret the phrasing of a question or get to different strategies for solving this problem. So it's knowledge of mathematics for teaching. That's the idea. It's not just do you know how to do it your way, but you know how lots of ways to do the problem. And then they didn't give the test in 2013, but they're giving it now because it turns out it looks like it's pretty predictive. Then there's an interview, which is a basic structured interview where they have a set of questions that they're going to ask you, and they score your your answers on a bunch of different dimensions in how you apply to that. And then there's also a small mini lesson that you had to submit, 10-minute clip of yourself teaching. And then if you passed that stage, you were invited for a full audition, 30 minutes. And that could be live in the beginning. In the first year, a lot of them were live, and then that got phased out, and you submit a video. Okay? So that's basically the TeachDC application. And at each stage, there's a threshold for your score. So this is the... Yeah. I will. I'll show you a table that shows you the numbers. Yes, I will. So just to give you a sense, you have to get over a threshold at each stage. So this is the general essay in the very first year, and we were heavily involved, so we told them, score everybody with a decimal place. That's really nice. Don't give whole numbers. And we actually had them randomly select people who failed to put them over, so we could actually see the full distribution of the correlation matrix between stage 1 and stage 2 scores. In stage 2, they also randomly passed people, unless you got the absolute worst score possible, which probably means you couldn't write English. They didn't want to pass those people. Okay, and then you can see this is the first stage in the next year, and this is in the next year. And it gets lumpier because we're really not involved anymore, and they started just giving whole number scores. But it's still a pretty clean, fuzzy RD on who gets moved on at each stage. And we'll use that a little bit to do sort of parametric selection corrections, and that's, we don't have a killer instrument, but we can use this a little bit to get at the potential selection problems. So here's the table you're asking for. So by year, 2011, 12, and 13, and this is how people kind of shook out through the process. And then at each place which people could end, I'm also going to tell you the fraction of people that get hired. You can see that just because you didn't make it to the end of the process does not mean you don't get hired to teach into DC. And also just because you don't make it to the end doesn't mean, if you make it then is not a guarantee that you'll be teaching. But there's a very high fraction, so 46, 40, and 52% of people hired into DC of those who made it all the way to the end of the process. In 2011, you'll see there's very few people who made it to the end. That's because they actually had difficulty scheduling auditions for a lot of people, and they had a pretty harsh cut at the interview. They decided to go back and push a lot of the people who passed the interview into the recommended pool, and that's why the hiring rates are higher. But we don't actually have the actual pool data from 2011. So we're speculating here that that those people are all in the recommended pool. We know that anecdotally that's what they said they did, and we have the passing at each stage. So we don't actually have like a list of who was on the who was on the website. So we're taking them at their word that that's what's driving these hiring rates to be quite high. But you can see that, for example, of the people who even you just put in their background data in the very first year, 13% of those people got hired. So you can get a job in any case. Yeah.
So I don't understand how you get hired if you're thrown out of this. There's a master list of everybody who ever applied?
Nope. So principals only see the recommended pool list. They don't know if you applied and failed.
But these are people then that went around to individual principals.
Yes.
And told them they were good.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, you can still, these jobs are still posted, so you can go and apply for a job. These are all people who are certified to teach, so they're all eligible to be hired. Yeah, that's right.
Like the last row is saying that of the people that passed this 30-minute audition,
Yep.
only half of them gets hired.
Half of them are hired into DC public schools. So remember, we only see people who are hired into Washington, D.C. public schools. So who are we missing? We're missing people who went to teach in Maryland and Virginia, and we're missing people who went to teach in a charter school in Washington, D.C., which are separate governance. They're not part of the D.C. public schools. So that doesn't mean that these people didn't get jobs teaching. It's just that they didn't end up getting hired into a Washington, D.C. public school. They may have gotten a better offer to teach somewhere else. Or doing something else altogether. Yeah, so that's another reason why we really want to get a survey out there for all applicants to understand what's happening. Yeah, DC has no idea what happens to people if they don't end up in DC. And that's not unusual for school districts to not know what happens to people who they don't hire. So just some summary statistics on the applicants, and I'm going to show this to you by the whole applicant pool. So we have about 2,500 applications per year. And I'll show you this for the whole applicant pool and then for the set of people who got hired through. And when I say hired through TeachDC, what I mean is that you're hired and you at least started the TeachDC process. Because as long as you started, we have data on you. It's not that you have to be part of the recommended pool. And what this will do is it'll help preview what's going to happen in the hiring regressions, because you'll see how the mean characteristics change between the initial applicant pool and the hired pool. So 13% of people got hired overall. 33% of the applicants say that they have no prior full-time teaching experience, and that proportion is lower among those who actually get hired. Undergraduate GPA, self-reported 3.4. It's almost exactly the same between the hired and the full population. The ranking of your college on a 1 to 5 scale is a 2.8. I don't really know if that's high or low. It's probably not so great. It's a slightly higher among the hired applicants than among the full sample. And then this is self-reported SAT math plus verbal or a converted ACT score. So we don't break out math from verbal because a lot of our applicant pool are taking the ACT. And so rather than trying to split it all up, we just are putting it into one thing. And it's almost identical between the hired population and the full population. And then we wanted a measure of whether an applicant was local, okay? And we don't know where everybody lives, so we coded it up as saying if you went to undergrad or grad school in Washington, D.C., you're a D.C. applicant. If you're not D.C., but you went to school in Maryland and Virginia, you're here, and then everybody else is here. And you can see that only 12% of the people who apply went to school in D.C., but 17% of the people who are hired went to school in D.C. And you'll see that robustly in the hiring outcomes, too. If you're from D.C., you're much more likely to be hired into D.C. And that may be labor demand. They want local people. That's consistent with some other evidence. But it could be labor supply, which is I'm from this area. I really want a job in D.C. I don't want a job in Virginia. Okay. So from the applications, so we have those background measures. But from the applications, we're also going to create 3 scores. The score of the written assessment of pedagogical content knowledge, PCK is what they call it in D.C. Then we have an interview score. Again, these are all going to be normalized, so there'll be like an effect sizes, mean 0, standard deviation 1. We do this slightly differently across years because the data looks slightly differently in 2013. And then we have an audition score. Okay, so we're just going to have, basically, you can think about this as three application scores that we're going to look at. So let me just show you some pairwise correlations between the variables. This is important to figure out sort of how you might want to structure the analysis. Like, are these things just picking up on one underlying factor, but also thinking about what's going to happen if I put these things in the regression at the same time versus doing them one by one. So not surprisingly, the academic background measures aren't going to be moderately correlated with one another. These are all self-reported with measurement error, but they're still obviously going to be highly correlated. And then teaching experience, slight negative correlations with the academic background measures. Sorry, did you see a hand? Okay. Now here is where I thought it got quite interesting. So if you look at the correlation between the written test and the interview and the audition, they're almost completely uncorrelated. Okay. And then if you look at the correlation between the interview and the audition, so these are the 2 correlations there. And then if you look at the correlation between the interview and the audition, even though the interview has a mini lesson embedded in it, this correlation is still quite low. So if you thought these were just kind of capturing, all 3 measures were just capturing like one factor, and we just had sort of a cheap screen for that factor, then a more expensive screen for that factor, then an even more expensive screen for that factor, I would have guessed you would see much higher correlations. Now, it could be because these things are all measured with so much error that they're not going to be very highly correlated. But of course, if they're measured with a lot of error, we're not going to see them be very predictive of performance either. Okay? But it's notable because if you think about what they're capturing with this information, they may be capturing different sets of skills that all lead to a more effective teacher, as opposed to sort of measuring the same teacher's skill 3 different ways. Okay? But that's, it's also consistent with this just being riddled with measurement error. We don't know. Okay, and then academic qualifications are slightly positively correlated with the application scores. Particularly your written assessment is the most highly correlated with your academic background, but still very low correlations. Okay, and that's why when we structure the analysis, we're going to show you results that look first at kind of the background measures, and then we're going to look at the application scores. Why are we going to do that? Just because I don't want to show you really, really long tables, and if we control for, if we put them in at the same time, the coefficients are very, very similar. So it just saves me space, and I think it's easier for expositional purposes. Yeah.
So is it going to be higher if you just look at the math, the DCPA,
You mean if I look at the content knowledge test and the SAT score, at the math SAT score?
Yeah, just because I thought that they had a hard time actually distinguishing their measure of pedagogical content.
From just like how good it, yeah. Eric, you writing this down?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, then I don't have to take notes. Okay, so we can check that. I mean, it's going to be a much smaller set of people, but we'll check it. Yeah. Okay, so we have data on all of the people who are teaching in DCPS, not just the TeachDC folks. So I thought it's worth just kind of doing some basic comparisons between the people we're going to be able to look at and the rest of DCPS. Percentage of female teachers is basically the same. Oh, I'm splitting up. Sorry. These are sort of the veteran teachers who were already in the system. These are the new hires who never applied to TeachDC for those 3 cohort years, and these are our TeachDC hires. The racial distribution is clearly different for the new hires versus the old veterans, so much higher fraction of African-American teachers in the veterans as opposed to the new, but pretty similar, distributions for TeachDC versus everybody else. Age, similarly, these are younger teachers, but similar age, average ages for the TeachDCs and the other people who are coming in. And then the kind of schools they're teaching in, the only difference, I think, is the middle schools. The veterans are much less likely to be in the middle schools. We have some evidence from Suzanne and colleagues and probably elsewhere that middle schools are not the most desirable places to teach in an urban system, so that may be why you're seeing more of the new teachers filling those positions. Yeah.
I know you talked about this a little bit, but I'm just trying to think. You have quite a few who never applied to TeachDC and
Yeah.
are still hired.
Yeah.
Like, how do we think about sort of who's applying to TeachDC versus who never applied?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, unfortunately, because I don't know who they are. I don't have any. This is like the basic information we have on them is some demographics that get collected. About 250 of these 840 are alt-certs. So they're either Teach for America or the Washington, D.C. teaching fellows. And then the other, 500 or so teachers or 600 teachers? It's a great question. I mean, these are just, people can apply through any connection they have to a school. These could be, you just know a principal, you have a letter of recommendation, and you apply. You're coming in from Virginia, you're coming from Maryland. No, because we don't. And the reason is the survey. We can contact all the TeachDC people because we see we have their contact information. Whereas if you just show up out of the blue in September, we don't. So I think the key thing with the application data, the key missing piece is that we don't know what happens to the people who don't show up in DC. We don't know who turns down an offer and goes somewhere else. And I think that's key for understanding selection, as opposed to understanding, where people are coming from who are filling these other positions. I think that's less of a priority for our understanding of this. I mean, it'd be nice if we could cover every other applicant to DC in general. I guess we could get that if we tried to interview the principals and have the principals report every time they interviewed somebody and who they gave an offer to, an informal offer to. My guess is that's going to be hard to get the principals to do. Yeah.
Easy though that you probably just look at if they're teaching in certain sort of positions, right? Like my guess is that probably non-TeachDC, they're trying to recruit for specific shortage areas. So it could be like SPED or bilingual or something like that.
We have that, and I don't think so. This is school type, and you see they're pretty close in terms of their distribution in K-8 schools, elementary, middle, high school, and other is going to be. I think probably like a special ed only schools, but we also have subject areas for the teachers, and I don't think they look like they're not Yeah. I mean, they look like they're filling lots of different areas. Of course, we have Teach for America and the fellows in here who are going to be filling very, hard to serve places. So, in their hands. Okay. The impact score, I'll tell you more about the system for evaluating teachers called impact in a second, but the evaluations for the new teachers are lower than the evaluations for the veteran teachers, and that's not surprising. People do better with years of experience. Slightly higher average scores for the TeachDC, people who applied to TeachDC versus people who didn't. And then just some basic attrition numbers. 20% of people are leaving DC, and then an additional 10%, even though they don't leave DC, they leave their school, and they go somewhere else in DC. We'll look at attrition later. These are pretty high. They're not, crazy high, but they're higher than, like, New York City, for example. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is trying to predict who gets hired out of the TeachDC applicant pool. Okay, and we're going to be running some hiring regressions. So I said we can't observe offers, just the hiring. We're going to run linear probability, but doing this in a probit setup doesn't really change anything. We'll put in some fixed effects for like what subject you're applying to in case it's harder to get a music job than it is to get a math teaching job. We'll sort of we'll deal with missing values by dumbing them out. And then what I want to show you, it's important, I'm going to show you unconditional results. That is, what is the correlation between characteristic X and higher? And then I'll show you results that condition on getting into the recommended pool. Okay? And that's important because some of the relationship between a characteristic and your probability of getting hired could be a mechanical thing, which is if I write a better essay, I'm going to be more likely to get hired, but it may be just because I got on the list, principal saw my name on the list, and therefore they picked me up. I'd like to distinguish that from if I can write a better essay, I have other qualities that even if the principal didn't read my essay, it's indicative of other qualities that are attractive to principals, that principals are picking up on somehow during their assessment of my fit for the school or my potential as a teacher. So this is prior experience, self-reported prior experience. The rookies are the left-out group. So if you have prior experience, you're more likely to be hired into DCPS than the rookies are. And that's pretty stable whether or not we control for whether you make it into the recommended pool. For undergraduate GPA, as you probably guessed from seeing the summary statistics, there's no correlation between hiring and your undergraduate GPA. But if we condition on making the recommended pool, that actually becomes negative, small, but negative and statistically significant because people who have higher GPAs are doing better in the application process. They write better essays, they give better interviews, better auditions. Small correlations I showed you, but still they're there. SAT, math, and verbal, the same thing. Barron's rank, we have a positive coefficient unconditionally, but once we condition on making it to the recommended pool, it's a 0. So if anything, on average, aside from any mechanical relationship between being on the recommended list at the end of the day, higher academically achieving applicants are less likely to be hired by a DCPS school. We don't know whether that's demand or supply. Evidence from Dale Ballou's old study in the QJE or Peter Heinrich's audit study where he sends out random resumes to schools suggests that principals do not value high academic achievement, and this would be consistent with that. Okay, but it could be demand and supply driving this relationship. Or it could be principals' expectation of the supply response, and that's important. We don't know what principals think in terms of who they could hire. So, for example, at Columbia Business School, I won't speak for the economics department, for the business school, if we see someone out there who's MIT's top econ student who already has 2 papers published in Econometrica, we don't interview them. Right? Not because we don't think they're good economists, but because we don't think we can get them. Okay? And maybe we're mistaken. Maybe that person is someone we should have interviewed. So it could be that if it's a demand story, it could be a demand story that's driven by beliefs about who can be hired and who can't. But anyway, the correlation is the correlation. You're less likely to be hired if you're more academically qualified. DC folks more likely to be hired. We saw that just in the summary statistics, and a little bit of extra boost to being hired if you're if you went to school just outside of DC relative to everybody else. Okay, and then if we run these are sort of putting these regressors in either individually or as groups. If we run them all in a big horse race, the coefficients or the general pattern of the coefficients does not change. And that's not surprising because these things are pretty uncorrelated with one another, except for academics are slightly correlated with one another. Okay, so now let me move to the scores. So first, let's focus on this column first. Having a higher scoring application is clearly positively related to the probability of getting hired, okay? Particularly your audition score, because you're going to be highly likely to get on the list. But once we condition on being in the recommended pool, almost all of that relationship goes away. Not all of it, okay, not all of it. The written score totally disappears, not surprisingly. And then about 70% of the effect of having a better interview score or a better audition score goes away. So if I can give a good interview to the TeachDC staff, I probably give better interviews on average. So it may be that some of that ability to give a good interview or look good on audition is sticking around and influencing who gets a job offer. Or it may be that it's something correlated with my willingness to go teach in DC. Okay, something to do with labor supply. But most of it is driven by the mechanical effect of being on the recommended pool list. All right. Now, if we run a horse race, it doesn't really change the qualitative results if we put them all in. And again, that's because these three measures, these three scores, were not very highly correlated to begin with. Okay, so now we have some evidence on who gets hired, who doesn't. We don't know whether it's demand or supply. Yes, Suzanne?
So could they also have looked at the scores?
They could have. They could have also looked at the scores. Yes, we don't know. They could have also been looking at the scores. Yes, completely. And I will say that most of the I don't have data on which schools actually have people do auditions, but it's fairly rare for teachers to audition at a school. It's very common to do an interview, but it's very rare to do an audition. So it may be that they're getting some of that audition information by actually looking at the data. I wish they tracked usage, but they don't. So the impact of so Tom can correct me if I misstate anything about impact evaluations in DC. Hopefully I won't. So every teacher in DC is evaluated annually based on a bunch of different criteria. First, they're observed teaching in the classroom, both by their school principal and by an independent master educator who observed them teach multiple times, and they get evaluated on the Danielson or some aspects of the Danielson teaching and learning framework. Oh, and I should mention that the audition scores in the TeachDC process, the scores are based on the TLF framework. Okay, so when they evaluate your 30-minute audition, they're using constructs from the TLF. Okay, that is something that we should keep in our back of our minds for interpretation. Yeah.
Do the applicants know that? Because they could potentially game it the same way they could grant.
Yeah, I mean they don't all do well. So, I don't know how much that applicant. We should go back and look at like what the materials are that they're given to see if they're told. I don't think they're told how they score them, to be honest. But okay, the second is the principal rates them, I would say, sort of holistically on their overall contributions to the school on a bunch of different standards, and they do that twice per year. Then the teachers choose a set of measures of student learning on which they are going to grade their own performance, and those measures are scored by the teacher themselves. Okay, or if they selected an outside vendor, they can use an outside vendor, but they can do their own. So I'm a history teacher. I say we're going to study Sacagawea all spring, and then we're going to have a big Sacagawea unit test, and that's going to be my measure of how much the students have learned. I'm going to grade that test, and then that's my measure of learning. But that sounds like it could be problematic. But the administration in the school approves that as a measure and then checks that they're okay with the grading of it. So there's sort of a check there that you're not just giving everyone an A, even though they don't deserve it, or that you've chosen a goal that is not an appropriate goal for your kids. But there is a bit of wishy-washiness there, and this is the one measure where we see a fair amount of top coding. That is, a fair amount of people getting perfect scores. You're not getting perfect scores on the other measures. Hand, yeah, okay. And then there's also this core professionalism component. This is essentially the principal can deduct points if you're absent or you act unprofessionally. This isn't a big contributor, but it's another principle-driven component. And then finally, for about 15 to 20% of teachers, there's a value-added score. So if you teach math or English in one of the grades where there's year-on-year testing, you have a value-added measure. So we'll look at value-added at the end, but it's not the main focus because it cuts our sample by 80%. Questions? Okay. I'm not sure. Did I get it? This is more or less right?
That's right, yeah. The only thing I would add that I think is kind of interesting is that over this period, I think all principals were on one-year contracts,
Mm-hmm.
which I think probably influenced some of the rating. I was surprised. I hadn't known that there was so much top picking.
In the TAS, yeah. There's some schools where almost everyone got 4 out of 4.
We
Yeah.
see quite a bit of harmony among the master educator and principal.
Yep.
and the TLF.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And I want to say one other thing. Oh, and principals, as of 2011, they have their own impact system. So your question you might ask yourself is like, well, how motivated are the principals to hire good teachers in the first place? They are, I don't know the answer to that question, but to the extent that it helps that they are being evaluated themselves year on year based on the performance of their kids and on a bunch of other holistic measures from a supervisor, they might have good incentives to hire effective teachers. So what we do with all these component scores is we combine them all into one factor. We run a factor analysis. Everything lines up on one big factor. We call it teacher quality, if you will. So we just pull it into one performance factor that we'll standardize. Doing it on the actual impact scores, we get very similar qualitative results, but the weights on different components changed pretty, not insignificant way across these years. We just thought it was kind of weird to score the teachers in 2012 differently than we would score them in 2011. But that's what we do. So now let's look at performance. Let's ask whether teachers who have certain characteristics also have better performance in the classroom or in the school. So I said it's a standardized factor. We're going to pool everybody. We're going to put in those subject fixed effects just in case, high school math teachers are graded more harshly than middle school English teachers. And then we're going to put in indicators for your second and third year teaching in DCPS. Why? Because the 2011 cohort, remember, we can observe them for up to 3 years. And you will get higher scores as you move on, so we wanted to think about taking that out. It turns out that our results are extremely robust to just removing those fixed effects because there's not any big correlation with attrition. These characters aren't highly correlated with attrition, and so whether you put them in or not doesn't affect the conclusions. Yes. So we can deal. Yeah. So we can deal with the sorting across schools. I don't have it to show you today, but we've run some regressions where we look at, let's say, school percent free lunch among the hired who got into schools that have more poor kids or less poor kids, and we get some small statistically significant effects there. So what we'll do is I'll show you results that put in school fixed effects. Within the school, at least with the data we have now, there's really not much we can do. I mean, we could do within the school and within a subject area, but then we're slicing and dicing the data. No, we have no student data. We have no student data, just teacher-level data.
Because you worry, with the observational scores, that they seem to be fairly correlated with the characteristics of kids in the classroom, right? More than value-added kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it's possible that we're getting that the robustness of school fixed effects is still not good enough because within the school, the teachers who have certain characteristics are being assigned to kids who look different, and that's driving their evaluation. I mean, I'll show you the component. We'll break it out by component. I'll show you principal versus independent evaluator. We get similar effects, but it could be that they're all being fooled by the composition of the classroom and not capturing something that's truly not. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Say that again. And we'll cluster the standard errors by teacher because we have the same teacher in there multiple times. And I said we'll separate by background characteristics and then by the application scores. So this is performance on your stated prior experience. These are, remember, this is like an effect size, so the standard deviations of impact performance rating. And we get basically nothing on teacher experience, a negative coefficient for those with 11 or more, but we have a very small number of people with 11 or more years of teaching experience. Remember this, when you think about prior teaching experience here, we would normally expect there to be returns to experience, but there's also the issue of the lemons problem, which is if I have 15 years of a teaching experience and now I'm trying to use TeachDC to get a job in DCPS, that might say something about my job prospect. So it's not clear, what we would have expected ex ante here. Undergraduate GPA. Let me just say, I'm going to show you unconditional and then conditioned on the recommended pool fixed effects. Okay, and you can see that doesn't do anything to the experience regressions. Undergraduate GPA, we see. Remember, this is self-reported, has measurement error in it. A 1 standard deviation increase in reported undergraduate GPA is a quarter of a standard deviation increase in performance. And moreover, when we put in the controls for being on the list, being on the recommended pool, the coefficient doesn't budge. Okay? Now, this shouldn't be too surprising because hiring was basically uncorrelated with your undergraduate GPA. But remember, when we put in these recommended pool by year fixed effects, we're soaking up a lot of the variation in who gets hired. And so if there's a big selection issue going on, we should see some movement in these coefficients, and we're not. Math and verbal SAT, smaller coefficients, but still highly significant. Barron's rank as well. And then for DC, these people were more likely to get hired, but they're conditional on being hired. We don't see higher performance in the classroom. And then if we run it with school fixed effects, we do get some attenuation here for the school fixed effects, but they're still highly significant predictors. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we're not norming. We haven't corrected the GPA in the sense that, like, if you got a 3.5 from Stanford School of Education, that's much, much better than getting a 3.5 from the Teachers College School at Columbia. We haven't done any kind of correction. Yeah, we haven't done that. I don't know if we have if there's a good way of doing that. You could interact the college selectivity with the GPA and see whether GPA matters more from people from highly selective colleges. But for now, we haven't done it. And then running a big horse race doesn't really do much. The only thing that you see going on is that SAT, math, and verbal is attenuated more than the others. Remember, these are pretty positively correlated with one another. And particularly, they're measured with error. So once we put them all together, like what's left over may be much more measurement error heavy than what's in when we just put them in one by one.
What is the standard deviation here? Is it from the full sample who applied and didn't get hired?
Yeah, from the full sample. Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh.
What is the standard deviation?
But remember, it's not correlated with anything. It's not correlated with higher. What's the standard deviation of SAT score?
Or the undergrad GPA? I'm just trying to get a sense of how much.
All right, let me.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. We can do it. It's quick. It's here, right? Oh, here. 0.4 or 0.45 for undergraduate GPA. So that's a big movement, I guess. But we do have some very low scoring, very low GPA applicants, and then 170 points, 175 points. So they're meaningful differences in SAT score. Okay. It's a great question. It's certainly I would imagine, predictive of higher. Certainly, people look at what your GPA is when they hire you. I don't know. It's a good question. Does anybody know if what from other literatures? I should know. We should have that answer, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, this is sort of a related question because I'm wondering about how to interpret this relationship. Like,
yeah.
I can imagine, for example, core professionalism is in the mix here, the school community.
Yeah.
Higher GPA could be a proxy
Yeah.
We loosely call non-competent. They're showing up to work. They're not as active.
Yep.
What are you going to show us just TLF effect?
I will. I'll break it up by component at the end. Here's the thing. In the end, one cynical way to look at all of this, and I'm sympathetic to cynics, so I'll give them their voice here, is that, look, I know how to get good grades. I've demonstrated that. I know how to get good scores. You tell me how you're going to evaluate me. I mean, it's not like we're popping in unannounced with some secret system here. I know exactly how I'm being evaluated. I know the day the person's going to show up, right? I know how to look good. You tell me I need to write on the board this way. You need to tell me I need to ask the questions that way. I'll do it. It has nothing to do with the quality of teacher that I am. It's sort of gaming and manipulation, right? And I've shown that I can do that. That's why I got into a really good college, and I took a Barron's prep course, and that's why I did well in the SATs or something like that. So that's, in the end, we're not going to be able to reject that, and it's important because when I show you value added, we don't get anything statistically significant. We have a couple of things, but basically we lose all statistical significance, and it doesn't look too rosy. And so you might say, I don't believe that you found anything because you're just showing me the stuff that predicts subjective, holistic evaluations, and those are gameable. And that would be, that's a problem. On the other hand, what are you going to do to evaluate the art teacher and the music teacher and the kindergarten teacher? You can test the crap out of their kids, but that's probably not going to happen. So we're stuck with some of these holistic measures.
There are one or two very old studies that suggest that GPA is correlated with incomes. Sort of minter earnings.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I have no doubt that people who get good grades have got to be somewhat more productive on a number of different activities, right? Whether teaching is one of them is, we can't prove that it's true effect versus some kind of gaming. Okay, so now the application scores. Quite large and statistically significant effects here. So almost a third of a standard deviation, 0.3 standard deviations for the subject-specific written assessment and for the interview score. Lower coefficient on the audition. And let me say, we've done some parametric adjustments to the standard deviation of interview and audition scores to adjust for the fact that we don't see scores on the people who don't make it through. Okay? So what we do to do that, I mean, there's no perfect way of doing that, but what we do is we assume homoscedasticity, so the noise of the relationship between, let's say, interview and audition is the same for people who have both scores than it would have been for the people who didn't do the audition. And we assume that the linear relationship between, let's say, interview and audition scores for the people who we have the scores for continues below the threshold. And that way we can impute and add noise to scores for people who actually don't have them and recalculate the standard deviation, which is going to be bigger than the observed standard deviation, and therefore adjust the distribution. Because that's going to make this, and that adjustment makes this coefficient on audition bigger, but it makes it bigger on the order of going from, let's say, 0.15 to 0.175. Okay? I found this initial correlation, this initial result, to be somewhat surprising. If you had asked me before seeing any results, which of these is going to have the biggest coefficient, the subject-specific written essay, the structured interview, which could have been on the phone, they weren't all in person, could have been on the phone, or a 30-minute teaching audition scored by some people who've been trained on it on the TLF framework, the same TLF that's being used here, I would have said, you could probably guess what I would have said, the audition. And yet it is the least predictive. At least it's the least strong and the least robust. That may say something about our ability to accurately, there's only one person watching the audition. They don't have a team of people. They're not doing multiple observers, et cetera, multiple classrooms. It may be that the ability to glean highly reliable scores out of a 30-minute video is, with the amount of resources that TeachDC is putting into it, is low. That they would need to put a lot more resources into scoring these things or ask for more evidence. But I found that surprising. I don't know if other people here find it surprising.
You didn't mention this, but who's doing the scoring of the TLF?
So they have on the TeachDC folks, they have basically people they have internal human resources staff who've been trained, but who are ex-teachers. Okay, they're now in part of the central administration, but they also have, they call them what's called teacher ambassadors or something like this. They have basically people who have gotten highly effective in DC are working, kind of doing, I guess, extra work scoring these things. So they've been trained, but I assume they've been through the radar training, but we should double check that. I'm pretty sure they clearly have been trained. I don't know if they have been trained in the same way as, let's say, the master educators have been trained. Yeah.
It would be kind of fun to see what about their first, an assessment of their first day in class. Because the problem with the audition is it's so much kind of this immediate establishment of rapport.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, what they're looking at later is after you've established that.
I see.
It's actually kind of a different.
So we have the full impact data, so we know what you got on your very first observation.
I don't know, maybe that would be better. I don't know how early on. I just always fear the first day of class, particularly when
Yeah, well, we're not going to get the first day of class, right? Because the first time they observe you.
But this audition is a little like that, isn't it? That's what I mean.
Oh, no, yeah. So the audition can be like that, but for most of the time, this is you submit a video of yourself teaching. So if you've been teaching somewhere else, you do a 30-minute video. Yeah. Okay, so the more important thing is what happens when I put in the recommended by pool fixed effects. Okay? Very little attenuation. Some more attenuation on the audition, but very little attenuation here. Remember, I killed all of the relationship between the subject, the written assessment, and hiring by adding these fixed effects, and 70% of the effect here, and we get very little attenuation. Okay? And so this is, I think, the biggest piece of evidence that I find supportive to think that that this is not driven by some skewy thing about who's getting in the system and who's not. That this is not selection bias. These people are actually performing better. Whether the performance metric being higher is something we want to clap our hands about, or whether we just think it's gaming, that's another matter. But these people seem to be doing much better in the classroom. And if we add in the school fixed effects, it does basically nothing, right? A little bit of attenuation here, nothing there. So the same principle, right, is giving higher ratings to the people who had these higher scores, even though they really weren't that much more likely to hire them, conditional on being in the recommended pool. Slightly more likely, but yeah.
I guess I'm not sure this is correct, but isn't it the case that the recommended pool fixed effects are going to be they're going to be correlated with these variables here in a way that might attenuate your estimates? Here it doesn't, so I think that's good news. But in your hiring regressions, if that's the case, I think it changes the interpretation. If it's just
No, I mean, the correlation between the covariate and the recommended pool fixed effects will be the same in both regressions. You're saying that?
Here it's good, but in previous regressions, I think you sort of rely on the decrease from one specification to the next with the fixed effects. And I think if it's just a mechanical thing.
Yeah. So what I'm thinking about is think about that fuzzy RD graph that I showed before, right? And what I'm saying to you is that the relationship between your score and hiring looks like a fuzzy RD graph, which is there's a little bit of slope on either side, but mostly the relationship is being driven by that step about who gets into the list. Whereas if I look at the relationship between your score, your performance and your score, it looks like basically a continuous line going through the threshold. Adding the threshold fixed effect does almost nothing. Doesn't take up any of that relationship. That's the key. Yeah. Okay. And then if we run a horse race, it doesn't really do much. But that's because these measures are, surprisingly uncorrelated with one another. They don't seem to be measuring the same construct. It's not like putting in one. I've done all the work of putting in all three. All three seem to matter. Again, the least robust being the audition, which was not my prior. Okay, so let me just show you a graph that we think demonstrates that at least to some extent, the TeachDC data collection process and the use of this recommended pool is helping Washington, D.C. to hire more effective teachers, or teachers that do better on the performance evaluation at least. So what we did was we just took everybody and we predicted their first-year performance using all of the coefficients in the regression, and then we plotted out actually how many of these applicants were hired, okay, by ventile, so 5% of the data at a time. And you can see that the applicants that were predicted to have the lowest performance, they're hired just a little bit more than 5% of the time. And then, average applicants are hired about 13% of the time. But the best applicants, according to all the measures we have, are hired sort of more than 20% of the time. And this is driven mostly by the mechanical relationship between application scores and being on that list that gets you hired. So we think that they could do a lot better, right? There's still a lot of information there that's maybe ignored. That is, if the hypothesis is correct, that it's the principals not using the information, not wanting to hire people with high SAT scores or that have a great subject-specific essay score, not that they really want to hire them and those people are just saying no. If it's labor demand that's driving some of this, then we could do a lot better than this, but at least as of now, there's some helpfulness of this whole data collection and dissemination exercise. Okay. Another way to think about the magnitudes of the effects that we're getting here, and I'll be honest, years ago, if you told me, can you predict who's going to be a good teacher, I would have said probably not. Right? The evidence is pretty, dismal that we can really predict who's going to be good, and maybe we should just give up on trying to predict who's going to be a good teacher. Teaching is a really complicated exercise. I don't think you can do it. Let's just watch people teach for a while, and then we'll fire the bad ones and pay the good ones a lot of money so they can stick around, et cetera. Okay? But we're getting very large effect sizes here. Very large. So what we did was we split all those all the people who make it into teaching in DCPS, we split them into quartiles of their predicted performance. Okay? And then I plotted out the density distributions for their actual performance in their first year in DCPS. Okay? And this is plotted, remember, this is impact performance index relative to the entire city, which is why almost all of them are left of 0 because these are all brand new teachers. Okay? But the difference between the average performance of a bottom quartile applicant and the average performance of a top quartile applicant is almost 2/3 of a standard deviation of first-year teacher performance. That's really big, right? It's really big. If we plot it by the stage that you arrived at, like how far did you get in the process, that's not really telling us anything. It's not just about the mechanical getting through the process. And then I did something else to sort of benchmark the magnitude of it. I said, well, let's take those 2011 hires. And let's look at the set of 2011 hires who made it, who continued to teach in DCPS for 3 years, all the way through 2013. So let's take a balanced panel. And then let's just plot the distribution of their impact scores over those 3 years. Not surprisingly, they do worst in their first year, and then they do better in their second year, and they do even better in their third year because they're getting teaching experience. They're also learning how the grading system works, and maybe they're learning how to game the system a little bit. But they're getting better at doing well in these impact evaluations. But that is only about 1/3 of a standard deviation. Okay? So we get less than half of the growth that we would if we could wave our magic wands and turn those bottom quartile applicants who made it into teaching into DC into top quartile applicants. So I think these are, surprisingly, to me, large magnitudes of predictive power. Let's see. Performance components. Let me break this out. So interestingly, teaching experience does show up in the TLF. It's not showing up in any of the other indicators, but it is showing up in the classroom observations. This is prior teaching experience. So maybe prior teaching experience, is mattering. It's just being swamped by the fact they do no better on these other 3 major parts of the performance metric. Undergraduate GPA shows up on everything. SAT, math, and verbal imbalance show up on everything positively, but these are smaller coefficients, but we saw smaller effects for those in general, and then nothing's happening for DC or Maryland and Virginia. Okay? But I was glad to see effects particularly on the master educator, because other than this, all of these three things can be heavily influenced by the principal, and so we would worry if it was only showing up on the things that the principal controls and not on the independent evaluator. How many thoughts? I want to make sure I covered the... Okay, let me go to the next one, and you'll...
You may be getting this. I was going to ask if you had done this for TLF subcomponents, because I was wondering which dimension of...
Oh, like 1, 2, 5, or 8, or whatever they use. I don't think we have. So which ones are you interested in?
Well, I'm just curious descriptively which elements of that kind of Danielson-like group is being predicted by things like GPA.
And do you have priors on which ones you'd be happy to see go up and which ones you'd be sad to see go up? I mean, they're going to go up. Something's going up on average. So.
No, just a curiosity. I do worry about.
All right.
I've heard some DC people talk about this. How you respond to student questions is something they worry teachers kind of decode quickly. I forget which one, whether it's 3, 4, 5.
Okay. So that's one that people can kind of figure out quickly how it works, and they. Okay. Okay. All right. We should. Yeah. All right. I mean, we have the data. We'll do it. Okay. And then this is the 3 application scores, and you can see they show up pretty much across the board on all of these things. Now, this does not use value added. So I'm going to show you value added separately. I'll break out the performance comments for value added, but I want to make sure people are okay with this first. Okay. So then let's look at value added. Okay. So now I'm limiting the sample to people for whom we have a value-added score. And, of course, the sample size goes way down, from 1,500 observations to less than 300 observations. And then the final 2 columns I'm showing you math and reading value-added. So interestingly, we see teaching experience is showing up in value-added, particularly for math. Remember, these are teacher-level standard deviations, not student-level standard deviations. I don't think they're crazy yet. They're not actually. This is actually not an unreasonable number. A half a standard deviation improvement in teacher value added for having sort of a lot of teaching experience. So this is interesting. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised because we see very consistent evidence that teaching experience does show up in value added, and it does show up in this kind of with this kind of functional form. So that's consistent with prior evidence, particularly in math. And then you see a positive effect in math for the for your academic credentials. It's statistically significant for the Barron's rank, but it's certainly not very big. Yeah.
It's also interesting that experience shows up, am I just blind, or it shows up a little bit for this sample in the other measures too?
Yeah, it's showing up certainly for this is the overall, and it's showing up for the TLF, mostly for the TLF, although a little bit. Well, it's not so consistent for the teacher-assessed learning, but it's showing up in classroom observation just like it was in the full sample, and it's showing up in value added. Yeah, which is encouraging for teacher experience. Yeah, it's encouraging. Now, why exactly they're not doing better on these kinds of measures, at least not significantly better, it's hard to know. Remember, this is for the full sample. These standard errors are big because I have a very small sample, but in the full sample, you don't see them doing better on these measures either, where I have a lot of power. And DC or Maryland, Virginia, there's nothing going on before. Now, here's where I'm less happy, okay? I would have liked to all see big positive coefficients here, and we're not seeing that, right? In fact, if anything, we see some negative coefficients as well. They're all very imprecisely estimated. I can't rule out some small positive effect, but it may be that these measures, again, we're also much smaller sample, but interview is showing up on all of the more subjective, holistic components of the evaluation, but it is not showing up for value added. And that may be because it's picking up on pieces of the evaluation that really aren't true teacher quality, or it's picking up on other dimensions of teacher quality that are not correlated with value added. And I think more evidence is emerging in the field every day or every week or every month that, hey, value added may not be just one of many noisy measures of a single dimension of teacher performance, but it may be measuring one of multiple dimensions of teacher performance. And so what's the right interpretation here? I don't think we really know right now. But it would have been nice to see positive effects here, and we're not seeing them. PCK is showing up positively across the board, and audition is initially not showing up for the principal and not showing up for the tasks. It's pretty weak. But again, this is just for that small sample of people who have the value added. Okay. Attrition. We'd like to know who's staying. That's probably another thing we care about. I don't think I care tremendously about attrition, but certainly the principals probably who have to do the hiring certainly care about attrition, so it's important to look at. The only thing we see really predicting attrition among the background characteristics is whether you're from DC. And so that, I think, is important if we think about why DC teachers are more likely to be hired. If it is a labor demand story that they're getting offers, one of the reasons they'd be getting offers is also because the principal knows that they're more likely to stick around. They have greater labor force attachment. But this also might be just another example of how they have greater labor force attachment. They're much more likely to accept an offer, and they want to stay teaching inside DC. So the next column here, what I do here is I'm going to add fixed effects for your impact rating. And why am I doing this? If you get a very low rating on the impact system, they fire you. So we'd like to know both the unconditional relationship and the conditional relationship. And what I find interesting here is that there's no statistically significant relationship between your academic background and your attrition. But once I condition on this, because we know if you're good academically, you're not going to fail the system, you actually have higher attrition from DC, slightly higher attrition from DC, more likely to leave. And again, that could be another reason why principals aren't super interested in hiring high academically achieving folks, because if they think that they're not going to stick around. This is leaving the school or DCPS, and the results are pretty similar. Okay, just more they're a bit bigger because now we can both dimensions of attrition are combined. But here is also quite interesting, which is the application scores. If anything, we see negative coefficients, not statistically significant, but it does not look like these high-performing applicants with higher subject essays, higher interview scores, higher audition scores, they're not departing DC. Okay, so they're very attractive in many ways, and once they're hired into DC, they're not more likely to attrit. If anything, they're slightly less likely to attrit, which I'd like to interpret as saying that labor demand is very important here, not just labor supply in determining the hiring. Okay, so let me go back to talk about the Haberman just for a minute. I know I'm starting to get low on time, but I think this is interesting. So positive and negative spin, that's just like how likely were you just to write "I'm great" when the thing was you had a positively spun question, and how reluctant were you to say "I'm not so good" when they have a negatively spun question. Those are meaningless. But anyway, extroversion is the one thing that we can get out of all the personality questions positively correlated with hiring. So people who say they're more extroverted are more likely to get hired. And if you have a higher score on the Haberman assessment, you are more likely to get hired, but that is not robust to controlling for getting on the recommended pool list. And that's probably because people who score on the higher on the Haberman have slightly higher academic scores. They write better essays, etc. Now, when we go to performance, watch what happens to extroversion and watch what happens to Haberman. I found this pretty surprising, given that the Haberman's kind of a kooky test, but we get very large effects of the Haberman assessment on the impact performance measure. A third of a standard, 0.3 standard deviations, and it's very robust to putting in the recommended pool fixed effects. Extroversion, we don't see anything on performance ex post. Okay, so if you own stock in the Haberman Foundation, you're happy about this result. I don't know exactly what the special sauce is, and that's one of the great things about the Haberman is it's not clear what the right answer is. Nobody knows the solutions, and so you could actually use this as a screening device because it's not obvious what the answer that you're supposed to put down is. So let me just wrap up with some discussion, and I'll talk a little bit about next steps. I think we find...
Was the performance rated or value added?
No, this is the overall, this is all the performance measures combined. So we have not split the 2011 cohort for Haberman out by component. We can do that. We'll have, if we had 280 teachers across 3 cohorts in value added, we're only going to have like 90 teachers, because this is only one cohort do we have this score for. So I think it's hopeless to think we'll find something on value added, but we should look at, just does it look consistent across the components for the bigger sample.
Before going on, what's the evidence that Danielson identifies effective teachers?
And, Met study correlates with value added,
The correlations are relatively low.
Yeah, they're relatively low.
And so this puts a lot of weight on these evaluations. Is there any external evidence that Danielson doesn't identify good teachers?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think about the Cincinnati evidence?
I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the one place where I'd say we have some good evidence. As it's administered in DC, do we know whether it's really picking things up that are useful? We don't. I think this is a very important issue you bring up, Rick, because we don't have value added on most of the teachers. We're going to use these holistic subjective classroom observations, and in most cases, the bargaining outcome is that these are pre-announced visits. People know the rubric. They, as Tom was saying, they can know, they kind of learn over time how they get their scores up. And so we worry about evaluating performance on something like this. And on the other hand, as I said before, how are you going to evaluate an elementary school music teacher? You're not going to give every kid in DC a music test. Well, I mean, you could, but I don't see us going that way. And so I think we're stuck a little bit with these soft measures, and I don't know if we're actually predicting people who are better. And so if you did an intervention where you sort of brought a lot more of these people into DC and their impact evaluations went up, it's not clear you've benefited kids, but you probably haven't made the kids worse. It's hard to imagine that these things are negatively correlated with teacher quality. So, yeah.
What brought this up is if the auditions are rated on impact
Yeah.
scales, then so if I say that we're going to judge teacher effectiveness by your ability to do 3-digit addition.
Yeah.
And then I audition you on your ability to do 3-digit addition,
Yeah.
and I find them correlated. That might not be as
And that's actually, it's interesting because I thought, so, yeah. So what's interesting is that that's why I would have expected that this would have been the biggest coefficient, because this is a score on the same thing that this is being scored on. And yet, I'd much rather know what you wrote on your essay, or how they scored you on your essay, than how you did on the TLF score on your audition, to predict your TLF score that your principal is going to give you. Because you're right, this, if anything, is like biased up because it's on the same scale. And yet,
I find that the other two count more is important, but it still would be nice to have external information.
Yes. Yeah, it'd be great to have some other check besides the independent evaluator who's doing the same scale, right? Just they don't have a horse in the race. I said this already. So, okay, and I just discussed that. Audition's not the strongest predictor. So I'm inferring, perhaps incorrectly, that it seems like principals are not putting a lot of weight on academic background or whatever the characteristics are that drive Haberman, even though these things seem to predict performance. We do see them less likely to hire rookies, non-locals, and introverts. And the principals are hiring from the recommended pool, but it appears that they're not putting a lot of weight on the continuous score that someone's getting that's that is driving whether they cross the threshold or not. They're simply paying a lot more attention to just who's on the list versus who's not on the list. Now, that's good for our research if that's really what they're doing, but it's not good for teaching in DCPS. So what we're trying to do is move the needle on getting principals to pay attention more to the continuous metric. I'm going to skip a lot of this, some of the discussion that's come up. I'm kind of pushing a labor demand story, and that's consistent with some other evidence. Particularly, I really like Peter Henrich's audit study, where he sends resumes out to a bunch of schools and looks at callback rates for people who have very different characteristics. And if you look at callback rates for low, medium, and high GPA resumes, if anything, there's an inverse relationship between the GPA and your callback rate. And these are not small variations in GPA. I mean, the low GPA, I think, was like a 2.8 versus the high GPA of like a 3.8. And that could be because principals think they're not going to get the high GPA people, but they don't even respond to an email to figure out maybe there's some special reason why the high GPA candidate would be interested in teaching in their school. And the one thing that they do seem to pay a lot of attention to is whether you're an in-state person or an out-of-state person, and that is consistent with what we're finding with the DC folks being more likely to be hired.
How the charters, there are just so many charters right around those schools that
Yeah.
seem to be potentially more appealing places to teach. So that's the only reason I'm...
So I've asked Jim Wyckoff whether the charter data on who the charters are hiring can be gotten, and he seems to indicate it's not forthcoming. Tom, you might...
Yeah, we're still dancing. I think Aussie is DCPS.
It's outright. It's a totally separate governance organization, and they're not very willing to...
Don't play well with them.
Yeah, so we would love to know who's being hired by the charter schools. And so I think the way we're going to try to get at that is just go directly to the applicants and ask them where you're working. But because getting the administrative data is probably not going to happen.
Do you have any information on the principals? Who's adhering to the recommendations?
Who's adhering?
Who's following the suggestions of the evaluations?
Oh, okay. So we just started exploring this somewhat, and we just plotted out sort of what fraction of your applicants came from the recommended pool versus from some other place. And I thought maybe we're going to see this very large bimodal distribution where some people are using it and some people aren't. It turns out that the distribution, I kind of checked it with against Monte Carlo. It looks like it's pretty close to like a random. It doesn't look like there's some set of principals who are not using it and some set that are. We can try to push a little bit more on that, but it didn't jump off the page as like saying, aha, there's only some places that are hiring the recommended candidates and some people that aren't. But we can also do, we can do more. We just started sort of going down that path. I'm going to skip a little bit of this. We don't know a lot about how people make hiring decisions on the ground. That was the gist of that slide, so it would be good to get some of that. We sort of have data here at the intake stage. We have data at the end stage, and we really have a gap in our knowledge about what happens on the ground in the middle. So we're going to incorporate some more data. That's nice. We'll get more power, and we'll get another cohort. But I don't think that's the real innovation that we're going to try to push on. We're going to try to push on nudging principals, which may be a totally worthless exercise because maybe the principals don't need nudging. They really want to hire these candidates. They are offering them jobs, but those people are turning them down. But it could also be that the nudge might work. So what we're doing is we're deriving with DC. We're basically using rounded off coefficients from our regressions, kind of coming up with a weighted application score based on all of the attributes that they're collecting. And then the candidates that go on the recommended list are going to be sorted in descending order. In addition, they're cutting far fewer people at each stage. Why? Because if these things are not correlated with one another, then just because someone did bad on the first stage doesn't mean you want to ignore what's going to happen to them in the next two stages. You might want to know if they're going to knock the ball out of the park in the next two stages. They're cutting fewer people, and they're going to sort in descending order of score. How were they sorted before? Alphabetically. We're going to work a little bit on whether we can use alphabet as an instrument. We kind of figured that one out, but they were sorted alphabetically. Now they'll be sorted in descending order of their score, which should help people pick the first one on the list. And they'll also be adding Qs using letter grades. So there'll be A+ applicants, A minus. How far do you want to go down? You're on your recommended list was unclear. I think they're settled on C+ as like the lowest recommended applicant that they would put out there. And so we don't have an experiment, But if we see sort of a discontinuous change in the patterns of hiring people with these characteristics in this current recruiting season, then I think that would be pretty convincing evidence that nudging principles could actually meaningfully affect who gets hired. So I will. Yeah, question.
So the principal won't know who is not included, like who's rejected.
They won't know who's rejected, but very few people this year are going to be rejected. Yeah. So to get a C+, you're going to have to be pretty far down the list. You're going to be on the left side of the bell curve. They're going to reject. I forget what their cutoffs are, but they're much weaker than they were before. Yeah.
Because otherwise, hiring a C guy who's not in the list, just because I don't know he's a C, is more probably than hiring.
Oh, I see. So I might be more likely to be hired if I just miss being on the list than if I get on the list but you label me as a C+. You might be right. Time will tell. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you see that the in-state applicants get hired more often. If it's because they like more connected, they know more people, maybe they know someone they're supposed to know, and that if this is like somehow related to the Haberman, like I know it's like being well connected is like could be like associated with having higher score in this case.
Yeah. I don't think being from DC is at all correlated with the Haberman outcome. The Haberman's kind of like not correlated with anything. But you're right. It could be that you're more likely to get hired because you have local connections, and that could be important for teacher quality because you're from the neighborhood, you know people, you know the community, you know the kids. So I don't mean to say that it can't be a marker of quality, but we don't know in our sample whether it's just teacher labor supply or labor demand. I was just pointing out that the other evidence suggests that could be an important labor demand component to it, that principals really want the local people.
Okay, so we're going to continue this outside with wine. Is that right? Are we there today? Yeah, we have some wine and food outside, and let's continue the conversation out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.